This is Shalom World Podcast.
Welcome to Voyage. This is a podcast where we take you to the world of the Apocalypse of John. This is the book of Revelation. I am your host, Frances Hogan. We continue at the beginning of chapter 13, where we're told that the beast had 7 heads and 10 horns. And then further down, we're told that these heads are emperors. So it seems that I give you a list of the worst and the most hated and the most feared of the Roman emperors. And I don't know anybody who has worked out the list to any level of satisfaction, but the list I'm giving to you is the one that has Domitian as the 8th emperor. And it seems that John wants the 8th one to be Domitian. Try and see if I can get that across to you. The first one was Tiberias, who reigned from 14 AD to 37. Amazingly, they don't count the first one, Julius Caesar. Caligula, or Little Boots, was reigning from 37 to 41 AD. Claudius from 41 to 54. And the infamous Nero from 55 to 68. Now, Nero committed suicide. And as a result of his suicide, there was absolute chaos in the empire. And there was 3 emperors in rapid succession. Now, a lot of the scholars trying to get to Domitian leave out these 3 in the numbering, which I'm doing as well. And then you come to Vespasian as the 5th one, who reigned from 69 to 79. And Vespasian had 2 sons, Titus and Domitian, and both of them became emperors. Titus was the 6th one from 79 to 81, very short reign. And then Domitian from 81 to 96 when he was murdered. And that was the same year in which John himself died. Okay, so it would make sense if John was saying that the one who was, is not, and is to come is Domitian. Because when Titus was made emperor after his father's death, he was out on one of their campaigns in the Middle East, and he couldn't come back to Rome for some time. And so his brother Domitian picked up the job while his brother was away. And then, of course, when Titus came back and became emperor, he had to step down. So he was and is not. And then he was the one to follow Titus. So the blasphemous titles that are on the heads of the emperors doesn't mean that it's literally written on the heads, but it means that these emperors actually claimed blasphemous titles for themselves. In actual fact, they assumed titles to themselves that belonged to Christ. For example, they were called Divos or Sebastos, which means divine. They were called God or Son of God. Okay? And it's very, very interesting when you read the Gospel of St. Luke and the way St. Luke actually gives you the proclamation of the birth of Christ. He gives it to you in the same language with which Rome would have said that a son to the divine Caesar had been born. It's amazing that Luke actually lived to the age that he did once he had made that kind of declaration. Nero once minted coins on which he had his face on one side of the coin and Savior of the world on the other side. So you can see that they assumed titles that actually belonged to Christ. And so this is John's way of saying this is anti-Christ. These people are doing the very thing that the great opponent of Christ will actually do. So it meant that the Caesar reigning was the Antichrist. Now, then you're told that there was a beast from the land as well. He said, I saw that in verse 3, that one of the heads seemed to have had a fatal wound, but that this deadly injury had been healed. And after that, the whole world marveled and followed the beast. In other words, there was some kind of a setback for the empire that made the people really give themselves to this system and that they would worship the beast. Now, worship the beast was emperor worship. And so the terrible choice that was given to the early Christians was, would you offer incense to Caesar or would you offer incense to God? Who is Lord, Caesar or God? So the head that seemed to have been wounded and healed was a temporary setback for the empire. Now that temporary setback could have been the suicide of Nero and the chaos that followed, and then they got back on their feet again with Vespasian. So the wounded and resurrected empire then becomes a parody of Christ dead and risen, wounded and risen. And of course, we saw in chapter 5 of the book of Revelation that when Christ appears for the first time in the drama, as distinct from the vision in chapter 1, that he appears as a wounded lamb, wounded and risen. Okay, so here you have the wounded and risen empire. It's the Antichrist. Okay, and so the beast from the sea is a parody of the Lamb and all that he stands for. And John wants the early Christians to see this, that Satan apes God. He can do nothing else. God is the only model that is there. So both of them have horns, which means power and means of communication. And both of them have swords, but the sword that the Lamb has is the sword of the word of God, which he carries in his mouth. Both are slain and rise to life and have authority over people. But the difference, the massive difference that John wants to point out is that while the Antichrist shares Satan's throne, Jesus shares the Father's throne. And we will see as this drama pans out who it is that actually reigns. Initially, Satan will give the impression that he's the one in charge and that he's the reigning. Now, in verse 4, we're told that the people prostrated themselves in front of the dragon because he had given the beast his authority. And they prostrated themselves in front of the beast, saying, "Who can compare with the beast? How could anyone defeat him?" Now, that challenge is going to be answered absolutely in the chapters that follow. Who can compare with the beast? Because the name Michael, the name of Michael the archangel, is who can compare with God. And already we've seen Michael the archangel defeat Satan in the courtroom in heaven. And now he's got to defeat him in the battleground on earth as well. So who can compare with the beast? It seems that the ordinary people go along with whatever the state says. And that is so even today, that if the government says something, the people will just go along with it. But we're going to see that the people who truly know God are going to follow the scriptures and what the scriptures say about God. Psalm 35 verse 10 says, "Who can compare with the Lord?" Exodus 15:11 says, "Who is like you among the gods, O Lord?" And the extraordinary thing is that in this beast that turns up in the first Christian century, the people have forgotten that God already has beaten the gods of Egypt and has dealt with Babylon and has dealt with Assyria and the other empires that went before this particular one. But people don't read history really, and they don't learn from history, so they're destined to repeat history, unfortunately. It's very important that John emphasizes something in verses 5 to 7 that I want to read for you now. For 42 months, that's 1260 days or 3.5 years. For 42 months, the beast was allowed. It can't happen if God doesn't permit it. He was allowed to mouth its boasts and its blasphemies and to do whatever it wanted. It seemed as if God was sitting back and not caring. Now, if God allows it, he allows it for a great purpose. We'll deal with all of this. And it mouthed blasphemies against God, against God's name, against his heavenly tent. Now, don't forget that the nation of Israel is dead, so the heavenly tent is the church, okay? And all who sheltered there. And it was allowed to make war against the saints and to conquer them. And it was given power over every race, people, language, and nation. You're talking about a superpower. And if you're talking about the first century, then it's all the nations around the Mediterranean Sea and North Africa, going over as far as India, that the Roman Empire had managed to get under its control. If you're talking about the end times, which we will deal with later, then you are talking about a worldwide empire. like the New World Order involves every country on earth. It was given power over every race, people, language, and nation, and all people of the world will worship it. That is, everybody whose name has not been written down since the foundation of the world in the book of life of the sacrificial lamb. So there you have something very, very important, that the people who will worship the beast are not the people of the lamb. The people of the lamb will not worship the beast. So the book of life is actually terribly important. Jesus told John to warn Sardis, that was the lazy, dead church, that their names could be blotted out from the book of life. The book of life is mentioned in chapter 13, verse 8, which we've just read, chapter 17, verse 8, chapter 20, verses 12 to 15, and chapter 21, verse 27. And all the time, if your name is not written in the Lamb's book of life, you are not going to get into the New Jerusalem, and you won't get into paradise. You have to make sure you are a citizen of heaven. And so the sorting out of the human race happens during this terrible time. The book of life represents the fact that in the ancient world, all cities and kingdoms had a register of their citizens. And your name was only blotted out from the book if you had committed a terrible crime and you lost your citizenship, or if you died. So it's the same with the heavenly book of life. If you lose your citizenship by terrible immorality and idolatry and all the rest of it, you're gone. But you can repent while you're still alive and get back into the book of life. But if you approach the judgment of God and your name is not in the book of life, you don't have a prayer, because we're saved through the precious blood of the Lamb. It's through the sacrifice of Jesus that we are saved. And it's a wonderful thing that St. Paul tells us in Ephesians 1:4, that we were registered in the Lamb's book of life from the foundation of the world, that our calling is ab aeterno. Everything that God does is from eternity. God didn't start doing things just because time and space came into reality. Everything he decided is from eternity. And from eternity, he wants you and me to be with him forever in heaven. He wants us to be in his book of life. He sent his beloved Son to pay the terrible price for our redemption, to achieve that purpose so that we would find glory with him. So we find that this superpower, which John is talking about, which he calls the beast correctly, that it will persecute the church. And John warns the Christians to realize that the state is not divine. Now, the people of the USSR in the 20th century had to find that out very quickly for themselves. The state is not divine. The state cannot demand worship, although it tried to. And millions of people gave their lives in sacrifice and in martyrdom because they would not worship the state. It was exactly the same thing as had happened in the first century. Now, why did God give us that example in the 20th century? We were to be completely ready for the Antichrist's reign in the 21st century. We were to have this historical reality very close to us. It might seem to us that what happened in the first century is very far away and won't apply to us. But when we have seen it in very recent history, we cannot do that. We have to acknowledge that this is something we have to learn from. We have to know the state does not have absolute power over you. It has no right to demand that you worship the state, that you put the state before God. It's God first. It's God last. And it's God middle. The state is not divine. It cannot demand the ultimate allegiance that is due only to God. And that's why in his first letter, St. Peter, in chapter 5, verses 8 to 9, urges brave but spiritual resistance to the demon coming at us through political power. And he tells us, St. Peter, in 1 Peter 1, verses 3 to 9, that our way to victory and to glory is exactly the same way as Jesus, and that is you take up your cross and you follow him to death and to resurrection. And that's why the people who get all the accolades in the book of Revelation are the martyrs, the ones who've paid the price. the ones who are most like Jesus. So if you want to be a person who is taken out of the world and escapes all of this, and you refuse to take up your cross and you refuse to lay down your life for Christ, I just feel sorry for you. I really do. I really do. So John calls us to faithful endurance under trial. Jesus is our model. And the thing I love about St. Peter's letter is that he was the very one in Matthew 16 who said no to redemption through suffering. But God knows the right way to deal with the human race. And if the human race could be redeemed any other way, he would have done it. And so it's through this terrible trial of having to live 3.5 years under the Antichrist and have this terrifying persecution that will sift the church like wheat, just as Jesus told the apostles that before his passion and death, that Satan was going to sift them like wheat, and they would all find out who was who. And they would all find out just how much they loved him and loved God in the trial. It's going to be exactly the same for the church as well. Exactly the same. We're all going to be sifted like wheat, and we'll all know who's who. And the most amazing people will get crowns of glory, and the most amazing people will deny the Lord. That is the incredible thing about human nature. It's the incredible thing. But if you think that you can go to heaven on cushions, forget about it. Jesus said, if you want to be a disciple of mine, you must take up your cross and you must follow me. So he chose the way of the cross and suffering to redeem us. And he wants us to have enough love for our brethren out in the world who don't know the Lord and who are going in the wrong direction, that we would actually join Jesus and put our little drop of water in the wine of his redemption so that we can be part of him, that we can go and face God in the judgment with the insignia of Christ, that the cross is all over us. That's the insignia of Christ, that we will bear the cross, okay? We have to be like him. The body must be like the head. It's the whole Christ that is going to do this incredible service to an ungrateful humanity who doesn't care less because they do not see the terrifying future that is there for them if they're not redeemed. They just don't see it. Okay. So John wants us to have enough vision to see through what is going on in our world today, as he asked Christians in his own day as well. And obviously they did hear him, because our Roman martyrology shows us the most incredible witness of men, women, and children who gave their lives for Christ happily so that the world could be redeemed. That Jesus had said to us, I want you to love them in the same way as I love you. As the Father has loved me, so I love you, so you must love one another. That's John 15:9. But he's telling us that we really must be wary of any political system that tends to take over the spiritual and tends to take God's role. As soon as the world goes down, the world powers go down that rule, then we have to really take note and take care. And John wants us to see that the Antichrist idea turns up from the very beginning. He told us that in his first letter in chapter 2 from verse 18. Antichrists have already appeared, he said, in the church. When you read the letters of St. Paul and the other letters in the New Testament, you'll find that the false teachers and the false prophets had already turned up. We see that in the 7 churches of Asia, that the false teachers and the false prophets had already turned up. So John is saying something that is completely new. And I've already told you that in Israel, before their judgment in AD 70, that the false teachers and the false prophets and the false messiahs had turned up just as Jesus had warned them. So we're being told to really become alert and to stay awake. That was the one thing that Jesus said to the apostles before his passion. Stay awake, stay awake, stay awake. He says it 5 times in one passage in Mark 13, for example, to tell us to stay awake. And the church today seems to me to be asleep and not realizing the enormity of the crisis that is upon us. Thank you for listening. Slán agus Banach Déileh. Goodbye. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and others.